Hello everybody and welcome at this DDMRP webinar. We are very happy that you are joining us here today. So the topic of this webinar will be what's the way to Demand Driven MRP. We prepared a little bit of an agenda for you. So first of all, we will start with a little introduction about who is Solventure and who is our speaker of today, Kilian. Then he will dive a little bit deeper into this topic of DDMRP. And he will explain you why DDMRP, the 5-step plan, a little bit more about his research and the next steps. But first things first, a little introduction about Solventure. Solventure is actually a company specialized in sales and operations planning. Sales and operations planning, we don't really see it as a standalone island in the company. So that's why we also make the link between S&OP and the company's strategy, which we call strategy-driven S&OP. This vision, the S&OP process consists of 6 building blocks, which are customer product segmentation, product management, demand review, inventory planning, supply planning, and executive S&OP. So how do we optimize this S&OP process? To do so, we look at 4 pillars. So we will look at the people, at the process, at the tools, and at the analytics. On the tooling side, we have the Arqiva S&OP software. So we implement this software. We are the European implementation partner. This software can support each of the 6 building blocks I mentioned before, and is also listed as a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. To make sure that our Arqiva tooling system can communicate with all of your other systems, like for example an ERP system or a CRM system, we also invested in a data connector. But the tool alone is not good enough, of course. It's not a magic wand. So that's why it's also very important to look at the people and at the process within your company. Because without a process, it will be hard to get the best out of your S&OP tooling. And also the people have to get the process, get the tooling, believe in it, trust it. Because if that doesn't happen, people will just go back to their old habits. So I mentioned the people, I mentioned the process. I mentioned the tooling, and next to this, there is also analytics. At Solventure, we are very innovative. Innovation is in our DNA. So we have certain solutions for different challenges in the market, like for example, leading indicator forecasting, where we will look a bit further into the external indicators you can use for your forecast optimization. It will also give you better understanding of the drivers of your market. And we also have MEIO Plus, which is a multi-echelon inventory optimization. The ultimate goal of all our different products is actually to bring balance in the supply chain triangle of service, cost, and cash. If you bring balance into this triangle, the triangle is right in the middle of our slide, you can maximize the ROCE of the company, which is the return on capital employed. And what does supply chain exactly have to do with it? Well, supply chain is a department in the company that has insights and impact on the service level, the same for the cost side and the same for the cash side. So if you can optimize your S&OP process, there will be a balance in the triangle. And at that point, your S&OP process and your supply chain are actually really a competitive advantage of the company. On the next slide, we have some of our customers listed for you. We did optimization projects in different industries, as you can see. Today we are going to dive a little bit deeper in DDMRP, and to explain you a little bit more about this topic, I brought my colleague Kilian Vincke.
Thank you.
Hello, welcome Kilian. Kilian is a project manager at Solventure, and based on his experiences here at Solventure, but also his previous experiences like with Federal Mogul or with Tenego, he got triggered by the DDMRP concept. He conducted some research about it, and today he is here to share some of his insights with you. So Kilian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, let me first start by saying thank you everybody for joining. I'm very excited that we have quite a broad audience today, and it's a new and exciting topic for me, and I've been with DDMRP and with the story for a little bit now. So, but let me first maybe elaborate a little bit why I conducted this research and how I really got into the topic. So obviously everybody knows the pendulum, and you swing on the one side and there's another effect happening on the other side. And I think some of you, well, actually most operational supply chain managers have at one point in their career managed a year-end inventory drop or a target to reduce the inventory. And even maybe a somewhat off arbitrary target, I think it might seem. And this type of decisions, cutting safety stock and then trying to make sure you still maintain some kind of service level, you see it coming. It's an endless oscillation that you create between the quality of the service you offer to the customers and the cash investment really that you want to make as a company. Not only does this type of decisions make the life of the planners a hell, but it also passes on incorrect signals towards, for example, the suppliers. I think some of you might know this effect. It's called the bullwhip effect. And then secondly, why does this type of thing happen over and over and over again? So, well, one of the triggers definitely is that the short-term demand, which we all face, customer orders that arrive, will never match the long forecast and the long supply lead times that we have. So how do supply chains handle that? Well, they typically, and most of the big companies rely on the MRP logic from the 70s. And this is really a technique that was invented to make sure that we can load forecast on the one side and we can try and calculate how much components or raw materials we need to purchase to compress this lead time, to make sure that we anticipate for the longer lead time on the one side and the shorter on the other side. Now, in the meanwhile, we all know that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and even ambiguity of the modern world has significantly increased. And so this technique, unfortunately, seems to be a bit outdated. Something else that is a side effect of this is that, and especially in that MRP story, that planners work without seeing a clear priority. So planners just see due dates changing, and it creates some kind of firefighting and replanning. So planners lose track of the priorities and hence also lose the fight of protecting both the top and the bottom line. A last element, which is definitely sometimes causing empty shelves and expensive air freight, is the fact that the strategic importance of that inventory level is underrated. And as said, sometimes the targets to reduce are arbitrary, and so they're not really connected to the overall strategy, nor to the business priorities. All right, so I was facing, at one point, I was facing the same challenges, and I was on an assignment in the beautiful Johannesburg in South Africa, and I came across a very interesting course, the Demand Driven Leader course, given by Karel Petak, author of the book, the most famous DDMRP book. So it was soon clear to me that what they were creating and in fact still building on is a unique solution, a unique mix to many modern supply chain problems that I faced firsthand in my daily life as a planner. So it definitely triggered something in me. Fast forward 2 years, I'm back in Belgium, and our CEO of Solventure is challenging me. I am partaking in the executive master class of supply chain at the Vlerick Business School, a collaboration between the Ghent and Leuven University, and he's putting the topic of demand-driven on my agenda, and I was actually very excited to dive deeper into it. And to make sure that I really understood what this was about. So how I want to handle this, first I'm going to take you through the step-by-step plan. In fact, it's quite an easy road to DDMRP and what are the building blocks. And then secondly, I will also give you some of my takeaways out of the research which I conducted. I will then just have a short summary at the end, just to look into the elements which we will take up in the future. So let's start with the 5-step plan. So the ultimate aim of DDMRP is to create flow. That means making sure the right information is going one way and the right goods and the right flow of goods and work in progress and raw materials is going the other way. But often people just start to randomly put inventories in the MRP system, so there's no real structural thought about where the inventory should be. So the first step of DDMRP is to really think about a strategic decoupling. I'll come back to that a little bit. So that's position. Second is protect. Protect is really then to calculate how much and when do you need that inventory, and to make sure that that's not only static, but that's very dynamic. Then the last part is really the execution part. So you've defined where to keep inventory, you've defined how much, and you need to make sure that it flows. And we'll show the main technique which is used in DDMRP and what type of visibility DDMRP creates, which is also a very, very interesting and value-adding element. So first of all, decouple your supply chain. Like I said, often the planners get the question, okay, how much inventory do you need and when do you need it? But in fact, that's not the most important question. The most important question is, where does this inventory need to be? Inventory need to be positioned really at those essential strategic points where it can dampen variability, where it can compress lead time, and really make sure that when the calculations are run, the calculations to calculate how much raw materials we need to purchase, how much work in progress we need to create, that those calculations are not reshuffled every single time, and priorities are changing all the time. That is not what we want to aim. So we want to make sure that we have a system in place that can guide the right priorities through the supply chain. Hence, adding decoupling points, make sure that you can dampen that variability. And the fact is that we make sure that from the strategic, on the strategic level, we have the right raw materials, the right work in progress buffer levels installed in the overall supply chain. By the way, this is of course applicable for a production environment, but this is as much applicable for a distribution environment or the combination of both. Secondly, now we've decided where to put the buffers, then obviously we need to make sure the buffers are rightly sized. So there's 3 elements in DDMRP that are used to calculate these buffers. The average daily unit, and which I think I'll come back a little bit in my own research because that's quite an interesting element, but let's generally speak that that's the consumption over the lead time. So it's the consumption of the good over the lead time. It pretty much covers you from the moment that you purchase until the moment that the raw material or the work in progress that you need is delivered. Then obviously there's a safety element, and there need to be a certain coverage that you need. You need to have a protection, not so much safety stock. Actually, DDMRP doesn't like the word safety stock, but in fact it's used as a protective element. There is always some variability, and you will need to make sure that you maintain some strategic stock for that. The last element is the green zone. The green zone is really driving the supply order generation. Often that's the minimum order quantity, or at least a calculated figure that defines the order cycle. An additional element that the DDMRP team came up with is what they call dynamic adjustments. Dynamic adjustments is really meant to be able to ramp up those buffers during the season or ramp it down for that matter. Or for example, when you launch a new part, to make sure that you can also grow faster in your buffers if you know that this certain SKU will sell a lot quicker than expected from the actual data which you get. So if you would say I need 3 weeks average, but in the first week already you'll start at a much higher level, you can make some adjustments. So you've indicated where you want to put inventory, you calculated how much inventory you need to have, and then the last and essential element is, of course, how will I move from one buffer to the other? Because that's in the end, the game is to move as quick as possible through the buffers to make sure you can fulfill as much customer demand as possible. So to do this, they developed the Netflow concept. Netflow is a very basic calculation of what is on order with the suppliers, what is on hand at the particular stocking point, and what is the qualified sales order demand. In fact, qualified sales order demand is typically what sales orders do I see within the lead time. And for this matter, they use the decoupled lead time. So pretty much they look at the lead time from the on-hand point until the previous buffer. Because the previous buffer, as I explained before, protects you, so it gives you a much shorter lead time. Then this helps also to make sure that your buffers are a lot smaller than if you would need to protect the entire lead time of the production of the good. So an additional element that they've also come up with is what they call spike demand. So spike demand means if you get a certain order within that lead time that's significantly higher than your threshold, you make sure that you commit to some additional lead time. You either give feedback back to the customer, or you make sure that you immediately respond not only to the previous buffer, but to all the buffers that come before, so that you respond a lot quicker to that. All right, so now we've explained the logic. So the Netflow is really the position within the buffers that will trigger. And pretty much when your Netflow position hits what they call the top of green, it will trigger an order. To the bottom of green to the top of yellow will trigger an order to the top of green. So pretty much you reorder your green zone as your actual customer demand moves up and down. You can also see that in the graph. That's the effect that we're aiming for. So the top is the Netflow, and then at the bottom you see the actual inventory move accordingly with the two. So the difference between is obviously the difference between what is on order with your suppliers and what is open as sales orders. All right, the last element, which is I think also quite innovative, is the capability within DDMRP to give priorities. Priorities, for example, based on the buffer status alert and the on-hand alert. Both are really meant to make sure that if you have multiple items or multiple work in progress, for example, arriving at a machine or multiple orders in a warehouse, that you have an easy choice. So you, based on the demand or the position in the buffer that's coming up, you know if what you need to make today is actually relevant to fill that buffer and to make sure you get out of the red in the next buffer. So it gives you an easy priority setting to really make sure that you can maximize the availability of goods at the end of your supply chain. So let's maybe have a quick look at what the DDMRP Institute itself gives as typical improvements. So we talked about this compressed lead time, improved customer service to make sure, customer service first. So typically DDMRP delivers a 97 to 100% fill rate. Obviously that sounds a bit, that sounds crazy, but in fact it is the prioritization logic which makes sure that you can give service above and beyond the normal statistical calculations. At the same time, you have lead time compression. So while for many complex industries, sometimes you have lead times up to months, with making sure that you have the right buffers, that there's definitely a compression possible of that lead time. Then the typical inventory after a DDMRP implementation, and that must said that those numbers are compared against the typical traditional MRP scenario, show reductions of 30, 45%. And because pretty much the right information flows, you will also get a cost optimization within your supply chain. So you're really not producing anything anymore that you don't directly need, or that you won't sell anymore. You put a cap on excess inventory, which is really really benefit for lots of supply chains, which buy stuff overseas and spend a lot of money to getting it here in Europe, for example. And if you won't need that good until another couple of weeks or months, sometimes it is taking up a lot of cash. And the last point, it is easy and intuitive, and I think that was also a general comment that came out of my research, is that the planners and the managers who use DDMRP are amazed by how easy it is to use. At the same time, obviously, it requires a bit of a mindset change, because this flow-based principle is quite significantly different than the traditional MRP thinking. All right. So before we go dive a little bit deeper in my research, I just quickly looked up a quote of one of the influencers on LinkedIn. Actually, he's very active, but he has his own consulting company as well, Stefan de Kok, and he's written a whole article on what his ideas were about DDMRP. And he clearly indicated that a lot of companies will benefit and will get great value out of that. Of course, not all companies will get the same value out of it, but especially companies that have a smaller budget, or that are really battling against the classic MRP, that have not gone through a journey of really supply chain strategy in S&OP. Will be really benefiting from those principles. So it is something that can be used around the world. Okay, so the outcome of my my research, and I really enjoyed my research. It was quite an intense process. So we interviewed quite a lot of professionals, and we also took a survey that was conducted. So I think there was about 40 or 50 people, really a lot of business professionals that have gone through the DDMRP implementation. So I think there was really some nice participants and nice comments as well. So what did we investigate, or what did we look at? Well, there was 4 research questions that we tackled. First of all, the knowledge and the maturity level of DDMRP in the market. And it is clear that there's a big eagerness now in the market to first of all understand what this DDMRP is about, and to learn more, to see what elements they can use. Can they implement this, or how does it relate to their existing processes, and for example S&OP. Then second of all, an analysis of the influencing factors. And that I'm actually very happy to say, or what the outcome was for me, and which I was a bit uncertain about in the beginning, is how does this relate to, for example, company size or industry type. But it was clear that from the research that no company size, no industry type is really a relevant factor in predicting the success of DDMRP. In fact, if you want to look at what are influencing factors on the success, it's really about, okay, how seasonal is this business? What are the lead times that you face? And how unpredictable is your demand, specifically in the short term? So those are factors that play a much bigger role in the story. Also, how flexible are you in terms of capacity? I think that's also one of the elements that really can make a difference in making DDMRP a success or not. So then we analyzed the elements between push and pull within the DDMRP logic, and we went really step by step. So we investigated all of the 5 elements, and we asked some interesting questions. And I'll give a little bit about the content there and what the disadvantages and especially what the advantages are as well in the next slide. And then the last element was, okay, if you want to go through a DDMRP implementation, what do you need to think about and what kind of capabilities do you need to develop? And I think there, obviously, it is about, are you as an organization mature to handle this? Are you ready for a new way of thinking? And are you already aligned with what SNOP really stands for? So the first questions that I asked to the audience of my research were, okay, where are your typical decoupling points? And in fact, if you would look amongst the people that gave their input, it was quite spread. It was not just one type. So you can see that the people were from different industries. And then we asked them, okay, how do you choose to place these strategic inventory positions? And a lot of them actually follow the DDMRP literature, but I think even more are really applying their industry or their company knowledge. Some of them use a critical path study and some other mathematical calculations. But in fact, something else that we asked them about the decoupling points was, okay, do they shift after the implementation? And more than half said yes, when we did an implementation, decoupling points tend to shift. So really to make sure that we can identify where to decouple and are there mathematical methodologies to do this. This is one of the first areas which we like to do future research in as Solventure, also within our organization, because this seems to be a very critical point. I mean, it's a critical building block within DDMRP, and you don't want to just rely on the industry experts or the planners to decide where the decouple points are. So I think that's definitely something that we want to explore more in the future. And secondly, we had a look at buffer profiles, and we asked them some questions about that. First question was, are you calculating the average daily usage in the DDMRP buffers just based on history, or are you also using some kind of calculated forecast? And which you would think that they only would use demand, actually, real actual demand last couple of weeks, for example, and I'll come back to that at the bottom. But no, actually a lot of them either use forecast or use the mix of both. So use what they have calculated to really drive the buffer. So it is setting the buffers seems to be not something that's only purely demand, but there's also already some elements of forecast in there. It seems that the way that the supply chain community is implementing DDMRP is already a little bit beyond what the original scope of DDMRP was. And then secondly, we asked how many weeks do you include in the calculation of those average daily usage, and you can see that actually the bulk of the participants picked more than 12 weeks, which creates quite a stable demand signal. But at the same time, it makes the buffers less respondent to changes. Then we asked about the adjustment factors. And I must say that that was something that I was expecting that all the participants would really understand and would really use those adjustment factors. And a portion actually did, so about roughly 40% was using it, but staggering 60% actually didn't really use them at all, or did some adjustments for for other factors that were influencing. So there seems to be a bit of confusion about the use of these adjustment factors. So I think it's something that when you go through a DDMRP implementation, you really need to be careful about how you handle it, where you get your data from, and how you deal with that. All right, now maybe to end, and I like the overview. It is really the conclusions of the research. Is obviously DDMRP was constructed to beat the failures of MRP, and one of the failures of MRP is that it's not easy to use and definitely not visually strong. So I think DDMRP really had a go at that, and it's excelling in that. At the same time, I mean, we need to realize it is important to align with SNOP. And from our research and also what we see at Solventure, the concept of DDMRP can perfectly fit within the scope of SNOP. Yeah, I would even go beyond that and say that most likely DDMRP will not function very well if you do not have a full SNOP process. So you need a broader view on the organization, where the organization is going in terms of needing what are my strategic investments that I need, etc., etc. And as such, that's maybe not a stronghold of DDMRP to allow to make that kind of decisions, because you don't have that type of data. That data fits in a broader SNOP scope. Then some argue that as much as it's easy to use, but maybe sometimes a bit too simplistic in terms of calculation methods. For example, how the buffers are calculated. And I think that's one thing that here at Solventure definitely want to challenge DDMRP, is to bump up the analytics, to make it more state-of-the-art, and to connect it to a number of elements which we have in our traditional inventory process. Amongst others, multi-echelon inventory, of course. What is another challenge? Definitely master data and change management. It is a different way of thinking, so a lot of the participants indicated that if you do not have master data protection, if you do not have that quality management, and if you do not prepare the entire organization to think differently when you implement this logic, then it has a high chance of failing. And then the last point is, obviously there were some nice numbers mentioned for which we can benchmark against, but what are you really benchmarking against? Are you benchmarking against the old MRP 1 or 2, or are you really taking into consideration all the full option of the advanced planning systems that are on the market right now, that range from rule-based to linear programming or optimization? All right. So what's next? Obviously, here at Solventure, we want to turn your supply chain to a competitive edge. So we've thought this through, and we really looked at adding DDMRP as a building block in our total SNOP solution. So from our side, it really fits somewhere or influenced somewhere within demand on one side. You need to forecast, you need to have some data to feed into DDMRP, and obviously you do inventory planning, single echelon, multi-echelon, and that is very much compatible. DDMRP and the way buffers are calculated is very much compatible about how we think in inventory terms, and that can definitely be multi-echelon. We have extensive experience with multi-echelon. So I think that the difference between both is that multi-echelon as such is built on the premises that you want to optimize the service level at the end, and that in between the steps you can save some inventory. I think as much as multi-echelon uses the same decoupling logic, the DDMRP setup is slightly different because it uses the concept of the compressed lead times. So the calculation is slightly different, but as such, the two are definitely not contradictory. If you want to use some elements of one and the other, I think they're definitely compatible. And then the last step, of course, there's an executive element in supply planning. You need to be able, from that side, to make sure that you have production orders that you can launch material purchase orders, etc., etc. So there's definitely an operational element into supply planning. That said, DDMRP does not eliminate the need for long-term strategic forecast, nor for the other building blocks. In fact, I think segmentation and product management are, as much as they are part of our offering, for example, with Arkiva, they definitely need to be linked to DDMRP as well. And if you do long-term forecasting, you also need to do long-term rough capacity planning. And I think that is also definitely a process that cannot be eliminated. That needs to continue. So it is a nice addition to the landscape, and it makes sure that we have those elements of prioritization, of visibility, of easy to use. So in that sense, I think it's definitely value add. So today's end-to-end supply chain optimization has become very connected. In fact, the VUCA statement that we had in the beginning, ambiguity, variability is much higher. So you want to make sure that all those different levels are connected. And if you want to achieve planning excellence, a particular area of interest is definitely those decoupling points. So we've seen that from our side that we will definitely want to put efforts into connecting that to the multi-echelon inventory optimization. And that complementarity is for us definitely a building block for the future. So what are the takeaways? Maybe quick 1, 2, 3 before we hit some of the questions that come up. So what does DDMRP want to achieve? They want to create flow to help return on capital employed. What does that entail? It says always set the right priorities, very visual, and make sure that you have the buffers in place, the right inventory at the right time, at the right place. All right, well, thank you everybody for your attention, and I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. So maybe let's have a look at some of the questions that have come up.
Yes, for sure.
Is DDMRP in contradiction to multi-echelon as you start with decoupling principles? So as I explained already, within the multi-echelon calculations, we can definitely use the decoupling points. So there are many other mathematical problems that needs to be solved within the multi-echelon question, for example, the lot sizes. And if you use the decoupling points, it actually makes it a lot easier to handle, for example, lot size problems. So that's where we're currently doing PhD research on, and that was what Niels is about, who I showed you the quote. So definitely no contradiction from my side. So a very good question, is it similar to the Toyota production system? The original methodology of DDMRP is actually constructed on top of, for example, lean, but also on top of the theory of constraints. So it's really trying to incorporate the best elements of the different methodologies, they call it standing on the shoulders of giants, in fact. And I really like that statement. So if you want to start with DDMRP, it's you need to read the book on theory of constraint, the book on lean, so that starts the discussion already. The biggest advantage, at least from my side for DDMRP, is well, first of all, the planners. I think the planners have a lot easier life. They see immediately where it's burning, and they can sort their purchases on red, yellow, and green. That was something that I never had the opportunity when I was a planner, or at least we had to do that in some shady Excel sheet. So making sure that planners know that they don't need to validate the information anymore, they can just order, and then they can spend their actual time into the proper analysis and building up the strategy and communicating about it. That is one of the real strengths. Okay.
One last question.
One last question. There are quite a number of interesting questions. Those are maybe a little bit more complicated. The last one, let me pick the last one, is the relationship between the complexity of a supply chain and the use of the DMRP. In fact, I think the magic lies in making sure that you can decouple some of these elements. So in fact, if a total supply chain is complex, you typically can still segment it into smaller bits and pieces and make sure that those are manageable by itself. And then fit it into a total S&OP vision and make sure that you have other processes in place to connect them at the higher level to make sure that you have that alignment. So I think I just wanted to stress at the end again the importance of embedding it in a total strategic setup to look at your supply chain. Make sure you have your in-network optimization in place, making sure that you have that long-term viewing capacity and that you have those short-term elements to make sure you have the right priorities. I think that's creating the balance in our vision. All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Unfortunately, yes. Thank you very much for joining us today. So thank you very much, Kilian,
You're most welcome.
The interesting presentation. And we hope to see you all next time. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.